Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a spooky travel podcast.
The seat taken by a ghost.
Ghosts cannot transmit COVID. They can't transmit COVID because they're wearing sheets over their heads. They are the perfect COVID barrier.
Ryan, you do know that we're not doing a Halloween episode, right? It seems it is coming out on Halloween.
But it is Halloween.
It's coming out on Halloween, yeah. So I understand. But the theme of today's episode, it is much closer to travel themed because we're not talking about Halloween, the prevalent holiday here in the United States right now. Today, we're going to talk all about the festival, Día de los Muertos.
So the Day of the Dead.
That's right. Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
And you actually have been in Mexico on the Day of the Dead.
I've been in Mexico City on the Day of the Dead. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I forget. I remember we were recording at the time. We had the podcast back. Yeah. I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago.
It was probably 2 years ago,
right? Yeah. So it was near the beginning of the pod's life. And I had asked you to describe the face paint and the traditions and the food and the music. And you came back and just sorely disappointed. You had I think you had, didn't feel well or something, so you didn't get the face paint. And I
didn't get the face paint.
I thought we'd do a whole episode, and you just really disappointed me.
Well, I was there, and it became a huge deal in Mexico City as like a big public outdoor festival after the James Bond film.
That's right. Yeah.
So what Day of the Dead looks like in Mexico City now is a lot like what it looked like in the Bond film. So there's a big parade. There's people dressed in black. Everyone has the traditional face paint. It's a very cool scene, and it's fun because this extends beyond.
You've been, and all you're doing is recounting the Bond movie.
Well, no, but the Bond. But the funny thing is, so like this, it leaves like so people are out and they're doing the face paint stuff, and then that night, like if you're out at bars and stuff, everyone is also in the face paint. So it's a cool. I prefer. I would do the face paint every day if I could.
Sure, absolutely.
It's good for my complexion.
Well, your limited participation and analysis based on a James Bond movie is just not enough to feed my curiosity around Día de los Muertos. I find myself getting more and more enamored and anxious to learn about it. And so, Ryan, today we're doing the rare. I think this is first of its kind.
This is the first of its kind.
We're doing 2 interviews today to explore different aspects of Día de los Muertos.
This is like one of those weekend fresh airs where they've cut like the best of 2 interviews together. Except this is like just a regular episode.
That's right.
We bring a best of every episode.
So we're going to talk to 2. Well, I'm going to talk to 2 folks. Ryan took the week off. First, we're talking to Professor Davíd Carrasco of Harvard University, and he's a professor of the study of Latin America at the Divinity School, has a joint position with the Department of Anthropology, and he's going to dig into the traditions, the history, and many of the objects and traditions that go into the Día de los Muertos.
Well, that sounds like a fantastic interview.
Of course. I mean, he's a Harvard man, of course.
I mean, you guys go way back.
The second guest I have, Ryan, is a journalist for Texas Monthly, and he's most well known as their taco editor. His name is José Ralat.
A taco editor?
A taco editor. It was a big news story when he first got this gig. And he actually has a new book out that's this year that's all about the history of tacos.
So that seems to me, taco editor seems like the second best job in journalism after the Denver Post. They have a marijuana editor.
Oh,
so
sure. Yeah. There's some crossover between.
Totally. Well, I think if you put them together, you'd have a pretty good newspaper section.
Yeah, it's a hell of a column. I flip right to it. Jose's on this week not to talk about tacos, but he's going to tell us all about pan de muerto. He wrote a great article online in the Texas Monthly about the bread of the dead, one of the quintessential foods of Día de los Muertos. He talks about regional variations, some of the history, and even has some recommendations of places to get really interesting and delicious pan de muerto.
Now, as Catholics, we've had bread of the dead every Sunday, right?
You know what? Do you think that that's unrelated?
I think that it probably is related. Do you get into that in the interview?
Dia de los Muertos falls directly on the Catholic holiday. I mean, I don't want to give away the whole farm here. We haven't even taken off, Ryan.
It sounds very fun discussing different Catholic holidays.
It falls right on the Catholic religious ceremonies of All Saints Day and All Souls Day. And there's a lot of crossover between the Catholic religion and Dia de los Muertos really is the bringing together of the Aztec and pre-Christian cultures and the Christian practices. So, Ryan, I can tell you're already asking such interesting questions. I think we just gotta get on with the show. We should start putting on our makeup because it's time to take off. We got to talk about Day of the Dead with my two guests.
I think it's actually time to take off.
Tell the cabin crew.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
I'm joined today by Davíd Carrasco, the Neil L. Rudenstein Professor of the Study of Latin America at the Harvard Divinity School, with a joint appointment with Harvard's Department of Anthropology. And we're going to dig into the history and the way that Dia de los Muertos is celebrated today. So, Professor Carrasco, thank you for joining us on Out of Office.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
So to start just right from the beginning and the basics, for those who aren't familiar with Dia de los Muertos, what are its origins and where is it celebrated today?
So the origins of Dia de los Muertos, as I know it, really comes out of the sort of fusion of certain Catholic ceremonies having to do with All Saints Day and the way in which indigenous people in Mexico, the Aztecs, the Mexica, and other groups celebrated what we now call ancestor worship. And in the Aztec calendar, for instance, there was a month where offerings were set up, altars were set up, small hills were put on these offerings and decorated, and images of the dead were there. And so both the indigenous people and the Catholics joined together just 500 years ago, in 1521, to start this tradition of remembering the dead in this Mexican way.
And so is it primarily a Mexican holiday? Is it also celebrated in any forms in Latin America?
It's celebrated all throughout Latin America, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia. Many of these countries have their own version of Day of the Dead. The one that's the ceremonies that have caught the imagination of people in the United States the most come from Mexico, in part that Mexico's a neighbor, but many Mexicans who have come here, and especially in recent years, have enjoyed celebrating Day of the Dead, both in their homes and in public places, including museums and parks.
And, you've pointed to sort of two aspects of the holiday. One, which is the deeper religious aspect, what it stands for, particularly for the Catholic community. And then the other side, which is much more kind of a colorful festival. So let's explore each of those one at a time. So first, let's talk about altars. So you mentioned that the tradition was to honor the dead by setting up these mounds or altars. And how do altars play a role in today's celebration of Dia de los Muertos?
So the altars are, in a sense, places of invitation. They're places of invitation both to the living that go there and make the altar and then visit the altar during Day of the Dead events. But it's also a place of invitation for the dead, for those who have deceased. It marks a place on the terrestrial level where those who've gone to the other world know where to come back to, not only to be among themselves, that is the deceased, but also to be with the living. One of the ways for your listeners to understand this is to think about the phrase, just in English, Day of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
The dead don't have days. The dead are in the dark. The dead are underground. But this is a time of year where all of a sudden they do come into the daylight. They do have time on the surface of the earth. They do re-enter the rhythm of day and night that the living have. And so in order to signal to the dead where to come, the human beings create these altars. And on the altars, they decorate these altars with different objects that will both attract the dead And then when the dead come back, the dead can commune, they can eat, they can relax, and they can visit with, in the spiritual form, those family members and friends who have come to think about them and to be with them.
And is the altar a household object, or is it something that's set up at the cemetery or in churches?
That's a great question. You know, one of the things that's important for your listeners to understand is there's many Mexicos. There's many different ways in Mexico, different parts of Mexico, that this is celebrated. But typically, what the altar is first of all a home altar. We have them in our home every October and November, where we set up an altar in the house. These altars can also be put in schools. They can be put in churches. Typically, the altars have the following. The Day of the Dead altars have the following objects. First of all, the altars will have the food of the dead. And one of the things that's most enjoyable for Mexicans is what's called pan de muerto. Mm-hmm. That is the bread of the dead. And this bread is made, of course, in bakeries and in homes. It's always put on the altar with the idea that the spirits of the dead who come back will enjoy it, partake of it. They'll also be put on the altar, especially the home altars, the foods which the dead most enjoyed while they were living. So I have a friend here in Somerville named Estela Calzada. I've been to her home. She has an elaborate altar. It's a huge altar. It takes up half the living room. And there she cooks. She cooks for several days before the favorite food of the people in her family who've passed away. And she puts it on the altar in handsome plates. The third thing that's often on the altar are photographs. These photographs are very important. And the fourth thing is this very colorful paper called Papel Picado. The Papel Picado is a special colorful paper that represents a kind of the ephemerality of life, the vulnerability of life. But the other thing that's crucial in the Mexican practices for Day of the Dead is the marigold flowers. Marigold is actually the English name for an Aztec flower called cempasúchil. Cempasúchil is the marigold flower. It represents 20 flower. It's the flower of completion. And the idea here is that in some parts of Mexico is that the dead are blind, but they can smell. And they smell their way back by smelling the cempasúchil flower, which has a pungent, and that draws them to the altar where their pictures are, their favorite food, the papel picado, and sometimes other objects which welcome them and even make them laugh.
And within families, is it an important tradition? You know, you're putting up photographs of ancestors and favorite foods of ancestors who maybe younger relatives might not be familiar with. Is it a tradition that you share stories and prayers about these particular individuals? Is it a way to keep family history alive?
It certainly is, you know. So you can imagine that these altars may be up for a week before the actual Day of the Dead and may stay up much longer. So, you know, in our home, when we put these up, it kind of quiets down the room a little bit. There's a sense of respect and maybe some sadness, but also, recognition of the love and life of the person. Stories are told. Where I've noticed that stories are particularly told is that in a number of places where there are graveyards associated with a city, like Oaxaca City or a town, is people will start preparing for the Day of the Dead weeks before, gathering the flowers, preparing the food, and they go to the graveyard and they'll go to the area of the grave. They'll set up candles. They'll take the food with them. They'll take chairs, and they may spend part of the time cleaning off the grave, and then they'll spend part of the night or all night there. I've been to these kinds of vigils, and I'm going to tell you, Kiernan, it's really quite. There's a charm about it because there's whispers and the people are talking respectfully. You can see the flickering lights, the colorful flowers, the pictures. People will be eating. Sometimes music will be playing, not always so soft. So that's particularly where the stories are told. I remember once visiting one of these ceremonies in Mexico. I just went to learn, and I met a family there and sat with them for a while. And I remember turning to the young woman there and saying, "Well, why are you here?" She said, "Well, I came here to spend the night with my grandmother, and we just sat in silence for a long time." So there's storytelling, but there's also silence, so that, in a sense, they can feel the presence of the ancestor.
Well, it's an interesting marriage of the solemn and the festive, because you mentioned, for example, Papel Picado, which is very brightly colored, and I'm wondering if you could share, what are the characteristics of what Papel Picado looks like, what forms are cut into it, and what are some of the theories around the historic origins of the art form?
So Papel Picado it's a beautiful paper. It's very bright colors. It can be almost any part of the rainbow, and it's very flimsy, very soft, and so it blows. It moves with the slightest wind or breath, and that kind of gives a charming feeling, an eerie feeling sometimes, as though its movement represents the presence of a spirit. And so what happens is that over the centuries, some towns in Mexico, this is something the Spaniards both found and then they promoted. Some towns have specialists that really emphasize a certain type of labor, maybe carpenters or cooks, mechanics, things like that. And there's a town in Puebla, the state of Puebla, not far from Mexico City, called San Salvador Huixcolotla, which is considered the birthplace of Papel Picado. And here in this town, there were craftsmen who were sort of very skilled at taking this paper. Now, in the pre-Hispanic time, the Mexica and other people, they also took paper from certain trees, the amadal, and they used this paper for all kinds of things, not only to paint on, but to celebrate on, to write on, and so forth. Well, the people in this town, they crafted this Papel Picado, not only for Day of the Dead, but for other holidays. So it's colorful paper, and the way it's made is with scissors and chisels. That's originally. And these specialists would pass it down from generation to generation to decorate the streets. You'll see them over streets. You'll see them sides of houses, as well as the altars in the Day of the Dead. And the charm of these has spread throughout Mexico, and it's spread to Europe and the United States. Traditionally, it's crafted only by hand, but as time has gone on, the mallets and chisels have also been replaced by machines. But there's still people in Mexico who are very good at making these papel picados and hang them with strings or other things. And so they're wonderful things. We have them here in my home. The Peabody Museum at Harvard has always put them up at this time of year. You asked about what's the scenes on there. Well, that's one of the most fascinating things. The scenes on this papel picado are just marvelous. They you can see women, skeletal women, for instance, walking down the street carrying on their head baskets of this pan de muerto, for instance. Or you may see an image of an altar itself with a big pumpkin and a skeleton and drinks and so forth. Oh, that's one thing I forgot to tell you, that the other thing that you put on these Day of the Dead altars is often a skeleton, a sugar skull. You take the sugar skull and you put it there, and sometimes you'll actually put the name of the person on the sugar skull, or you could even make fun of things that put the name of your girlfriend or your boyfriend there. But getting back to the scenes on the papel picado, a certain political art form was developed in the 1890s and the early 20th century in Mexico by an artist named José Guadalupe Posada. And Posada himself was a newspaperman and an artist, and he began to make these kind of political cartoons where he would take, say, Don Quixote and turn him into one of these skeletal figures riding on a skeletal horse. Or he would take Emiliano Zapata, the great Mexican revolutionary, and show him with his sombrero and his outfit, but as a skeleton. And then he also began to take other political scenes or people in Mexico and turn them, and street scenes of people dancing or at a party or at a bullfight, and turn them into images of skeletons in this way. And some of those scenes make it on to the Papel Picado that is hung on altars and other places during the Day of the Dead.
It's amazing that we talked about Day of the Dead for over 10 minutes. We just got to skeletons. Because skeletons are a very popular iconography associated with Dia de los Muertos. So I'm wondering if you could introduce, who is Catrina?
So let me answer that in two ways. It's really good of you to raise this notion of the skeleton and the calavera, the skull.
Mm-hmm.
So, you see, in the pre-Hispanic world, bones, skeletal figures, which were buried in the earth, were thought of also as seeds. You plant seeds in the earth, and you put skeletons, or you put these bodies of the deceased in the earth. And the idea was, for instance, in central Mexico, was that these deposits were not just bones, these were the seeds that would lead to a sprouting of a new life. This was the death and life cycle. And there's a wonderful, before we get to Catrina, there's a wonderful story that comes from the Aztec period that represents what I'm telling you. So the story goes like this. The world was destroyed and went into darkness. And the gods gathered to figure out how could they, in a sense, create human life again. And they decided that one of the gods, whose name was Xolotl, who was a divine dog, that he had to go into the underworld and recover the bones of the ancestors. And so he dives down into the underworld, just like where you've planted the bones, and there he meets the Lord of the Dead, whose name is Mictlantecutli, the Lord of Mictlan. And he tells Mictlan, the gods have sent me to recover and bring back to earth the bones of the dead, that is to bring back the dead. And Mictlantecutli doesn't like this, but he says, okay, you can do this, but you have to pass 3 tests. And the main test is you have to take this seashell that I'm going to give you, and you have to make it sing on its own without you blowing into it. So Xolotl takes the seashell, and he calls the ants, and the ants come and they bore a hole in it. And then he calls the bees, and the bees come and they hover in those holes inside the shell, and it begins to sing. And now, of course, he's defeated, in a sense, this test with the Lord of the Underworld. And so the Lord of the Underworld gives him the bones of the ancestors. Now, he's a dog, so he's carrying these bones in a bag in his mouth as he's leaving the underworld. But the Lord of the Underworld has tricked him. And what he's done is he's dug a hole, he's covered it over with leaves. And as the dog is leaving the underworld with the bones, a quail flies up and scares the dog, and the dog jumps to the side, falls into this hole, and dies. And this is the key part. The bones scatter and break into different sizes. But since Xolotl is a divine dog, he regenerates himself. He gathers the bones together. He leaves the underworld and goes back to the gods. He takes the bones. One of the gods takes the bones, grounds them into a paste, and bleeds himself onto it. And out of this, the new humanity is born. But here is the punchline. The new humanity are all different sizes and shapes because the bones broke into different sizes and shapes. But now life has come back to the world because Xolotl went into the underworld and got the bones. So this is the idea that made itself across the conquest from Europe into the contemporary world of Mexico, the colonial and contemporary world of Mexico. This in part is the hidden meaning of these skeletons, that they're not just the dead, they're the dead who are the seeds for the new life.
And so how has that been transformed into popular culture today?
So one of the ways that this is transformed into popular culture today, in a humorous way, is a figure you asked about before, and that is the figure known as Catrina. Now, Catrina, who you see in many Mexican towns today in art, it's all through Mexican art. If you take a look at some of Diego Rivera's, for instance, great art, he's got a very famous mural, something about the afternoon in the Alameda in Mexico. There's the whole, all of the major historical figures of Mexico are there. And right in the middle is Catrina. Now, Catrina is a skeletal female, but now she's been dressed up in very fancy clothes, perhaps clothes you would associate with the French, a French woman of the 19th century who's got this elaborate hat and, all kinds of wavy clothes and so forth, representing La Catrina is, in a sense, the femme fatale, the woman who is attractive and vain, who dresses this way, but underneath is just a skeleton. Well, there happens to be a male version of this called La Catrine. And the Catrine is the dandy who overdresses and who tries to be very, elaborate and suave. Who has a cane, he may have spats. He's wearing a tuxedo, but underneath it, what is he? Well, he's like all of us. He's a skeleton. He's heading toward death. And so some people think this is one of the ways that Mexicans make fun of other Mexicans who wanted to become Europeanized, who wanted to be like the Europeans, who wanted to emphasize upper class superiority. And what is death saying? Death is saying through La Catrina, your vanity will not, in a sense, overcome the meaning of the Day of the Dead, which is you have your time here, but it's not the time of the living.
And in many places too, they'll do pretty extensive face makeup for the living to look like skeletons. And I'm wondering, all over Mexico and especially in Mexican folk art, I know if you go to, for example, the Museo de Arte Popular in Mexico City, you'll see skeleton figures in all sorts of arrangements. You have marching bands of skeleton figures and bullfights and, dentists and doctors and everything you can imagine. And I'm curious, what do you think is the role of humor in this? Because as you say it's actually quite a dark and solemn and kind of threatening thing, but there's certainly this aspect of laughing in the face of death.
Oh, absolutely. And I didn't mean to overemphasize the dark side, because this is really meant to be an uplifting kind of experience. It's a recognition of the dead, but it's a celebration. It's a celebration of this kind of pattern of death leading to new life, to a kind of a catapulting of existence. And as in the case of La Catrina and El Catrin, it's exactly what you say. There's this sense of laughter, an enjoyable laughter. Sometimes it could be a hideous laughter, but it's laughter. For instance, once our pandemic is over, where we have, of course, many more deaths than we would normally have, we want to invite everyone to come one day to the Peabody Museum, where we have a tremendous celebration. And the celebration for Day of the Dead there has exactly what you're saying. Many people come dressed up with this face painting of skeletal figures, but colorful eye shadings to look like, in a sense, skeletons and skulls, but skulls that also have these glimmers of life in them. All kinds of decorations and color and jewelry are part of this. There, of course, is the bread of the dead. People are drinking chocolate. The music is very vivacious. There's basically a sense that, to use a phrase from the great Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in the face of all this suffering, we react with life. We don't hide the suffering. We don't turn our eyes away from the death, but we do it in such a way, we present ourselves in such a way that we want to affirm the life in us. I call this convivencia. Convivencia is a Spanish term that really means, living together, being together. But my meaning of convivencia, which shows up in Day of the Dead, is that what you try to do in something like this kind of ceremony is you try to give life the upper hand. Life will never have too much of an upper hand over death, but you want to give it an upper hand. You want to acknowledge that death and decay and disease is there, but you want to also say, but even this can lead to an affirmation of our family, of our time together, and of our future together. So I think this is really, for me, the meaning of the Día de los Muertos.
And my final question is, our audience are travelers and curious people. I'm interested where you have experienced Día de los Muertos, and do you have any advice for those who, hopefully maybe a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, would have the ability to go and experience Día de los Muertos in some of these Spanish-speaking areas?
Oh, I think there's going to be many opportunities, both in this country and certainly in other countries. Bolivia has a very vivid kind of Día de los Muertos celebration, but I think Mexico is the best.
Mm.
And there are certain places in Mexico that you can go, especially in central and southern Mexico, where you're going to find vivid affirmations of flourishing of this. The state of Oaxaca and the city of Oaxaca is tremendous. The state of Chiapas. Oaxaca and Chiapas are the two most indigenous states of Mexico. Certainly in Mexico City, there's some parts of the city where there's a tremendous outpouring of the Day of the Dead. And I can't not mention the great film Coco that came out several years ago, because Coco is doing just what your question asked. It's raised an interest in Dia de los Muertos, even among the Mexicans themselves, because once children see this, they realize, oh, we want to make sure we're a part of this. And so I think the Day of the Dead is very much in our future, and I look forward to celebrating it with my friends and family in the future as well.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. And I pray that you are right, that at the Peabody Museum we can celebrate Day of the Dead. And as you know, I'm just up the street. So Professor Carrasco, I hope to see you at the wonderful altar with the Papel Picado hanging up at the Peabody Museum, hopefully a year from now.
I'll be waiting for you at the entrance.
All right. Hasta luego.
Hasta luego, and thank you very much.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
All right, and I'm joined in our second interview today by José Ralat, who has the very enviable title of taco editor at the Texas Monthly Magazine. And he, as far as we know, is the only taco editor in the United States. And he's really burnished that reputation by putting out a great book, which we're going to have him back on to talk about, called American Tacos, A History and Guide. But for today's interview, I wanted to talk about an article that Jose wrote in the Texas Monthly called Tex-Mexplainer, Pan de Muerto is a cross-cultural taste of history. And so this is where we're going to dig in to the bread of the dead, the go-to trademark food of Dia de los Muertos. So Jose, welcome to the pod.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, before we get into the topic, I will just mention that Jose has a stutter, and so you may hear that throughout the interview. So, Jose, can you just introduce for us what exactly is Pan de Muerto?
So, like you said, it translates to bread of the dead, linking it to Dia de los Muertos. It is a bread that symbolically is meant to nourish the long past on their journey back to the realm of the living to visit with their family and friends. And it's because of that, it is a seasonal dish. Now, let's not think that the spirits are actually going to eat this. The humans end up eating it.
Right. Right. So it's symbolic of that journey. And
Yes.
And where does it have a place in the traditions? Is it something that would be actually like left on the altar?
Yes, it would be one of probably many foods. Altars, sometimes called ofrendas, are packed with symbols of the dead, such as marigolds, sugar skull, calaveras, favorite items of loved ones, like maybe a favorite cologne and foods. So one of those is pan de muerto, but it could also be someone's favorite candy bar.
Okay. For me, it would be a jar of Nutella, I think. And for you, it would probably just be rows and rows of tacos, I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For me, it'd probably be golden Oreos.
Ooh, it's still seasonal. And so as research for your article, I'm assuming that you got out there and tasted a bunch of pan de muerto. So describe for us what makes it a special seasonal bread. How does it taste?
So the most commercially available, what is popularly noticeable as pan de muerto, is this round loaf with extra dough shaped like bones. Right atop it, it is generally topped with sugar, so it's sweet. But what makes it sweeter is the orange essence. So it's got this citrusy, kind of licoricey taste to it, and it's also very messy.
And how about the ingredients that go into it? I understand that it's a particular type of flour that they use specifically to bake bread of the dead.
Yes, so that can be based on the region, but it can be wheat flour, amaranth. Someone near me uses pumpkin flour mixed with orange flour, and I don't know how you make flour out of oranges, but
I was
that's
just
what he
wondering
told me. I recorded that interview and asked him about 5 times. Now, are you sure that you're using these flours? He said, yes. So that's what I had to write.
All right. Well, next year you could do a video segment on it and say, take me back to the kitchen.
I can walk there.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. One of my favorite details in your article is the photo, which is of pan de muerto in a Oaxacan market. Yes. And it is shaped like a human body with arms crossed and a painted face directly on the bread.
Yeah. And that's sugar.
Wow.
And you know, it's kind of crusty, right? And sweet and soft on the inside. But it's not really, I mean, that's what's so fantastic about pan de muerto. Is that, like any Mexican food, it is ultimately regional. There are myriad variations that can depend on household recipes versus commercial bakery recipes. just like there are thousands and thousands of moles.
Well, it's funny, in your article, you mentioned that Dia de los Muertos as a celebration is gaining popularity, and it inspired me to, I'm based in Boston, and it inspired me to dig up and look around and research some of the Mexican bakeries in my area who all have Pan de Muerto at this time of year. So the more I conduct these interviews, the more I'm ready to go out and see what the local variations here are, you know, what has traveled this far north. But I'm interested in asking you, you know, why do you think Dia de los Muertos is gaining popularity? Is this primarily due to immigration patterns?
Yes, I think culinary and cultural trends and traditions are not only bound together, but they're bound with population shifts. And so the more Southern Mexican immigration we've received, or the more Mexican immigrants that have ties to Michoacan, Oaxaca, Puebla, where Dia de los Muertos is widely celebrated, it got so trendy that it was in the James Bond movie
Right.
Spectre.
That's right.
And that parade that was in Mexico City was produced for the film.
Right. It's not even real.
No, well, now it is.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's great.
They just ran with it. They said, fine, we'll do this every year.
That is great. Well, you know, when people look back, you know, 200 years from now and say, oh, what is the deep religious origin of this parade that we hold every year? People go, oh, actually, it's a James Bond movie.
Right, which is a British spy, but it's an American film franchise.
Right, right. Well, and it's true. I mean, you do see Dia de los Muertos more prevalent in pop culture. And I would say that I think Coco, Pixar's Coco, was very educative for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the heart of the holiday of honoring the deceased and connecting and the thin line between the realms. I think there is, you know, there's something very human that resonates, especially for those who have lost loved ones. I think, you know, you look past the imagery and the face paint and all the fun of it. At its core, it naturally connects to everyone, and so I can see where it is gaining popularity as somebody who's not Mexican, but was raised strictly Catholic, as Ryan and I often discuss on the pod. I really understand its appeal.
As someone who was raised Catholic, but specifically Latino Catholic, I can understand that appeal because I grew up listening to stories of visitations by the deceased to my parents, you know, and that's kind of weird. I've never had that happen. But, you know, I get these phone calls at like 3 a.m. that are from my mom. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. I was asleep, but you woke me up. And well, I just had a feeling.
Wow.
Ma, I'm in my 40s.
Yeah. That's great. Well, yeah, see, that's the difference. Ryan and I were both raised in Irish Catholic households, and there, you know, it's, oh, he's dead and gone. Don't even think of him. And then they chuck a potato at you, you know. I like your way better. So, you know, I'd be remiss. This is a travel podcast, and the listeners love a tip, you know, an insider tip. And so I'm wondering, do you have a bakery or two or three that you might point to and say, I've tasted a fair amount of pan de muerto in my life. These are the places where you're going to get something interesting, something delicious.
Well, if you could travel safely, I would go to the main market of Oaxaca. Nowadays, you could go to Mexico City's Mercado Jamaica, spelled like Jamaica.
Okay.
Where they sell lots of flowers because the word translates to hibiscus. And within Mexican communities, you're gonna have, well, I should specify, within Mexican communities in the borderlands or a little farther north, you'll have bakeries. Sometimes they'll be across the street from each other, and they'll serve different versions. So, for example, here in Dallas, where I live, you've got Marroches, and then just down the way, you have Veras. You could walk between the two. As a matter of fact, I think they might be only 4 blocks apart. So you could spend a day within a Mexican neighborhood and just eat lots of carbs.
That sounds like a great day to me. Yeah, no, it's definitely on the travel dream list, especially now with the pandemic. We're all dreaming of what to do once it's gone. To actually travel to Oaxaca or anywhere in Mexico to experience Dia de los Muertos in person. And to really be able to try all these regional specialties and learn more. So you mentioned the regional variations that you can get. And so would you say, is there like a true, single true recipe? Or is pan de muerto kind of what the community makes it?
I would say that there's a common variety, which is the one I mentioned that kind of tastes like oranges and is sugary. But ultimately, it is what the home or the town calls pan de muerto. And it could just be as micro as a pop-up. Like the one in San Antonio called Comadre Panaderia. The owner, Mariela Camacho, gets very creative with all of her Mexican pastries. This year, she's offering chocolate pan de muerto and hibiscus pan de muerto. And I know that the hibiscus is really meant to emphasize the blood. And I think that's fantastic. Unfortunately, that's in San Antonio, 5 hours from where I live. Austinites can order via Instagram, and she will drive up to Austin.
Wow.
It's only like an hour.
Yeah.
So it's not that far. That's really the only reason I would want to live in Austin. But that's a whole nother story.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that has. Yeah. All right. We'll dig into that on the taco conversation too. Listen, as I say, if she's listening, it's going to require Nutella in the recipe to get me back from the other side. So start working on that pan de muerto. Jose, thanks so much for joining us, and happy Dia de los Muertos.
All right. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen. gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
All right, Ryan, we're here in the last stop. Can you, I mean,
I'm always exhausted after a layover, like 2 flights in a day.
I mean, two interviews. It was a heavy lift.
Yeah.
I hope you appreciate the effort.
I can feel them. I had to wear a mask for how many hours was that? It's exhausting.
But so what do you think of the interviews?
Fantastic. I want to get some taco recommendations, but we'll do that another time, I know. And B,
you probably learned a great deal about Dia de los Muertos.
I definitely learned a great deal about Day of the Dead. It goes beyond what I knew from, the James Bond and the Coco connection.
Sure, that's good.
It's more than that.
Expanding your horizons.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to our guests. But it's your favorite segment. It's my favorite segment. It's popularly known as the People segment. And it's where we each share one thing, just one thing. If you do 2, it's going to be way too long, particularly when we've already had 2 interviews.
Yeah.
And you're going to share one thing that fed the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workaday week. So, Ryan, I have to ask you, as I ask you every week, do you have a last stop this week?
I do have a last stop this week, Kiernan. In the spirit of Dia de los Muertos, and of course, Halloween.
Sure.
And Halloween is actually very popular in Mexico City. You see a lot of people celebrating Halloween. They fall sometimes on different days, etc. So when I was in Mexico City a few years ago, I had read about this cult that worshipped basically the saint of death, Santa Muerte. And there are several different, there are several different places where people gather to, pay homage to this saint. This is not a real Catholic saint, right? This is a popular saint, a saint in pop culture. But it is not like a real, Catholic saint.
So it's one of these, like, I've encountered this occasionally when I'm traveling in Latin America, especially, where it's sort of this figure that probably predated Christianity and then was kind of brought in to the pantheon of saints, even though it's not like an actual canonized by the Pope sort of person.
Exactly. It's sort of on the outskirts there, and it's the saint of criminals, and everybody needs a saint, Kiernan. Everyone deserves representation and
absolutely
and sainthood.
And it's Santa Muerte.
Yes.
So it's like some sort of death saint.
It's a saint of death. Yeah.
Ooh,
yeah.
Dark.
And so it is dark. So there's this in the outskirts of Mexico City. I mean, it's like a 45-minute Uber ride, way out in the outskirts. It's a place called Santa Muerte International, which is this 72-foot statue of the saint, and it's in like an old sort of cathedral with all these sort of it's kind of spooky murals and paintings about, and it's an active church for this sort of fringe religion.
Wow.
And the statue was built by this guy named Jonathan Lagaria, who was assassinated in 2008. He was shot 150 times.
That's a lot of times.
That's a lot of times. So his mother took over the temple, and that is.
Why was he shot that much?
It's unclear. I mean, you worship the angel of death. Maybe there's you got something else going on in your life.
Whoa.
Yeah. So. It's a very spooky place.
What's it look like? What's the statue look like?
It is a massive, what they call it, the bony lady, and it's a massive skeleton in in sort of a priest outfit with holding out her hands, skeleton face. It's a frightening statue, and it's in the mid. There's not a lot around it because it's the outskirts of the city, so it kind of stands out. You see this just massive skeleton of death. We'll put a picture on the Insta. That I took very quickly, and then I got the hell out of there.
So you found it frightening. I mean, that's pretty.
Yeah, it was definitely frightening.
It looks kind of like the Grim Reaper.
Yeah, 100% like the Grim Reaper. Yeah, totally.
Oh, that's pretty. It has a pretty spooky last stop, Ryan.
Yeah, well, I think it is a spooky time, Kiernan. Do you have a last stop this week, Kiernan?
Absolutely, I have a last stop this week, Ryan. As I said, this season, especially this quarantine season, and trapped in the house, I've really been diving deep and wanting to learn more about Dia de los Muertos. I really like I like what it stands for, the idea of reflecting and sharing stories of people that are close to you that have passed away. And
keeping your loved ones alive through memory. And
exactly. And I
but
wanted
in the United States, we don't talk about death. Not
in a healthy way. We don't know. It's to be avoided. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm growing up Catholic, I've never met anyone who died.
And I decided that I wanted to put up what we talk about in the interview, Papel Picado, which is the intricate tissue paper, colorful cut flags that are often used at festivals in Mexico. And I was thinking, where can I get some that aren't like knockoff Target Papel Picado? Which, by the way, Target has some Dia de los Muertos stuff I discovered. So it occurred to me, you got to go to a small shop and look for an actual artisan. And I came upon an Etsy shop called A Mujer. So it's Aymujer. And you can get Papel Picado there. It's for many different sorts of festivities. You have weddings, fiestas, for home altars, and indeed for Dia de los Muertos. So I got 2 strands of flags, have them up proudly in the house. I can include that on the Insta as well, Ryan. And remind me what the handle of our Instagram is.
OOO podcast.
That's right. Like, or maybe because it's spooky.
Podcast.
And I'm loving it. I'm getting lots of compliments on it from, the people that can see it from the street. Nobody comes into the house because, all the...
It's quarantine.
Yeah. And the baby finds it very attractive and enjoys looking at it.
Well, if the baby's amused, that's half the battle.
Absolutely, it's half the battle. And in fact, I invested in a book for him, a libro for my baby, and it's a children's book called Bebe.
Yeah,
yeah. You said it in sort of an Italian look.
My Italian would probably be amazing.
Probably way better than yours. It might make your Spanish better if you tried to speak Spanish with an Italian accent. And the book is called Gustavo the Shy Ghost. And it's Dia de los Muertos. It inspired the art of this children's book. And it's about a shy ghost who wants to make some friends. And the cover actually looks like Papel Picado. So I am deep in it this holiday season. And it's really pulling me through. Putting together this episode was a real joy.
Well, it was a joy to listen to, Kiernan. Thanks for doing it.
You're too kind.
Now, what are we talking about next week?
All right, next week I have an interview. Yet another interview special. I mean, I don't know what you're doing over there, Ryan. You're supposed to be sending out the interview queries. Next week, I'm talking to an author. Her name is A. Kendra Green, and she wrote a book all about the weird and wild and eccentric world of museums in Iceland. I love quirky museums.
Yes.
And her book is called The Museum of Whales You Will Never See and Other Excursions to Iceland's Most Unusual Museums. And it is a hell of a ride, really transported me back to Iceland. It's a great listen.
Yeah, well, I am a great listen?
Yeah, it's a great listen.
Oh, you read it. You heard it.
No. I read the book, but the interview is a great listen.
Oh. Yes.
I didn't produce a transcript of the interview that people are going to read. People listen to this podcast, right?
Well, debatably, yeah. It depends on the week. It is available for download.
Absolutely.
Well, Kiernan, before we go, can I just let people know that they should vote?
Absolutely.
They should vote. Vote.
They should really vote, for sure.
Yeah. Well, until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Boo. Don't boo, vote.
Oh, do you know who you're voting for yet?
I know who I'm voting for.
It's tough. It's close.
I'm going to go with Joe Biden. I had considered the other guy, but no.
I mean, in the spirit of horror and Halloween, you might consider the other guy.
Oof. I mean, it'll be a true Halloween on Tuesday if we don't win this one.
Please don't vote for Donald Trump, folks.
Vote Joe Biden.